Great to be with you on a day where we are focusing on the skyrocketing cost of college, especially over the last 15 years, but really going back decades. It's something that, as we talked about, smart people like former Education Secretary Bill Bennett back in 1987 with his Bennett hypothesis, these people noted that if we continue a student loan system where the federal government is basically making it really easy to provide all sorts of student loan access to people who want to go to college, it's going to drive up costs. Well, that has borne out. We talked about that in my opening monologue in the last segment. I want to dive in to some of the specifics of how we reached this point and also some of the negative consequences of the student loan debt crisis with a leading economist on this issue, Dr. Richard Vedder, PhD economist, distinguished Emeritus Professor of Economics at Ohio University, a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, and also the original director for the Center on College Affordability and Productivity. He joins us now to dive into this very topic. Professor, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Glad to be back with you, Jimmy.
Good to talk with you again. And if you wouldn't mind maybe scooching over just a smidge to your left, I think, and then that will make you a little bit more focused into the shot there. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So it's good to have you here. I know you caught a little bit of my monologue and some of the things that I was saying, but I'd love for you to synopsize for us, please, what your extensive research, and you've done a heck of a lot on this topic, Professor, what it shows about how we got to the point where we have over $1.6 trillion in student loan debt, with the average borrower coming out of college with nearly $40,000 in debt.
Yeah. Well, the reason why we have so much student loan debt is it's so easy to get borrow money from the federal government. As I think you had a segment on by Milton Friedman. Friedman decades ago said this. The government and Bill Bennett said it, and we all have said it, that if going to college is affordable by people being able to borrow, colleges will see this. They'll say, hey, great, we can just jack up our prices. And we can capture that money, not the students, rather the universities and the colleges. And so the research done by the New York Federal Reserve Bank, the National Bureau of Research, Economic Research, and other organizations show that for every dollar more that students borrow from the federal government, colleges and universities usually raise their tuition by about 2/3 of that, by say 65 cents out of every dollar. So the big gainers from the student loan programs have not been the students, it's been the colleges. And then what do the colleges do with all that money? Well, they spend it on themselves. By that I mean they hire more administrators, they pay them higher salaries, they engage in a bunch of social engineering projects that are near and dear to the faculty and to other administrators. Diversity and inclusion coordinators, sustainability experts, PR people, all of this. And they jack up the price of colleges. Who are the big losers? Students. And ironically, low-income students. The proportion of kids graduating from college these days, meaning the last 2, 3, 5 years, coming from the bottom quartile of the income distribution, the bottom 25%, that proportion is lower today than it was when the student loan programs were getting underway in the 1970s.
Yeah.
So and the reason is college, low-income kids see big sticker prices to colleges. That scares a lot of them away. They say there's no way we can afford that. Sure, maybe we'll get some scholarship aid. Maybe they'll discount our fees some, but we don't know for sure what that's going to be. Maybe we ought to skip college. So the big losers are low income people.
Hmm.
And by the way, minority groups who tend to be below average in income also suffer.
Yeah.
And so the big losers are, to be blunt about it, African Americans, blacks, Hispanics,
Yeah.
other low income people, recent immigrants to the United States, the people who allegedly we were trying to help when we started these programs in the first place.
Well, to emphasize that point, I want to put up pick four, Dr. Richard Vedder, and this includes reference to some of the research that you have done. What we see is some of the data demonstrating this point. So, first of all, Brookings Institution came out with a study back in early 2018 saying that it's at crisis levels, according to this study about higher education student loan debt. Using college entrants from 1995 to 96 and 2003 to 2004 as guides, so a little outdated, but still, the report finds that nearly 40% of borrowers may default on their student loans by 2023, and it observes a striking racial disparity as well. Black BA graduates default at 5 times the rate of white BA graduates, 21% versus 4%, and are more likely to default than white dropouts. And also, and this is quoting from a paper I wrote in 2018 for the Millennial Policy Center on higher ed costs and student loan debt, quote, as Dr. Vedder, our guest here, Christopher Denhart, and Joseph Hartke have noted, the original reason student aid programs were created was to make college more accessible for those in lower income brackets. Yet this has been an abject failure, contributing to greater income inequality. Strikingly, quote, in 1970, the bottom quartile of families by income accounted for 12% of total bachelor's degrees received by age 24. But those families only accounted for 9.4% in 2010. This is in large part because federal student aid programs have pushed up the cost of college to the point where many low-income students can no longer afford to attend. They are, in effect, priced out of the system. And not only that, I want to add this in. In addition, higher ed institutions have adjusted their need-based aid downward in favor of merit-based scholarships, given the existence of governmental programs like Pell Grants. Finally, lower-income students have a higher dropout rate than those families who are more affluent. This means that those students who do drop out have fewer economic opportunities before them, often while shouldering a relatively high debt burden, exacerbating income inequality. Professor Richard Vedder, how does the student loan system, as we're discussing, the way it is set up at the federal level, how does that system lead to the kinds of results that we're talking about here, particularly when it comes to minority communities and, broadly speaking, those in lower income groups?
Well, this is, of course, an extremely timely topic. We're spending a lot of time these days talking about the treatment of minority groups in the American population. I would argue that the American government has done less than zero, less than zero. They've been on balance harmful to minority groups in the United States. And this goes beyond higher ed issues. Of course, there are other things, the welfare system and other dimensions that go beyond the line of questioning we're going into today. But we have enticed a lot of people to go to college because they have heard nothing but you got to go to college. You can't be a success in life unless you go to college. So we push a lot of people to do that, and they do, and we get many of those going to college are coming from schools where they have poor preparation. Some of them are encouraged to go in spite of the fact that the probability of their succeeding is very, very low. But hey, if they flunk out of college, the colleges don't lose anything. They get their tuition money. The students maybe end up with a large loan payment that it's very difficult to make, particularly given the fact that they are not able to get very good jobs. They're college dropouts. They're stigmatized because, they couldn't quite succeed in life. They dropped out of college. So this is psychologically debilitating for them as well. And so I think we have consigned a class of people into a rather miserable existence. And it didn't have to happen. Indeed, there are other ways we can finance higher education that would help people of limited incomes, other than the one we're doing. And we should be focusing our attentions on getting rid of the current system, I think.
Again, Dr. Richard Vedder is our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, distinguished Emeritus Professor of Economics at Ohio University. What you're getting at more than anything is a warped incentive structure for colleges and universities to just continue providing these student loans and grants without any, or rather to accept students and keep raising tuition because they know that the flow of student loans and grants is going to continue. But also, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that if you go to college, and say you drop out after about a year or 2 years, and you're already coming out with $25,000, $30,000 in student loan debt, or maybe even $10,000, whatever that number is, and you drop out of college, your income earning potential is significantly reduced, and you're going to be struggling to pay down that debt, meaning it will exacerbate your cycle of poverty. That is stunning and a very striking point, I think, that we need to keep in mind here, because especially in this regard, Dr. Vedder, when we talk about the student loan system, oftentimes you will hear Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others say it's because we don't have free college provided by the U.S. federal government that people are struggling like this, especially in the minority groups that we're talking about in lower income communities. So how do you respond to that sort of criticism based on the way the system actually is structured as we're discussing?
Well, yes, the answer of the individuals you named is let's give it away. Let's make it free. After all, that's what some European countries have done. They've had free college or relatively low cost college, and those countries are surviving. By the way, with generally low rates of economic growth and so forth. So let's do that. What would happen if we did that? First of all, college would become a joke in terms of what it does. It's supposed to further the dissemination of knowledge. It's supposed to have a certain enriching qualities, raising them productivity of workers and so forth. How is that going to happen if you have lots of people go to college who are ill prepared for college? As it is now, 40% of the people who enter college full time do not graduate in 6 years, not 4 years, not 5 years, but 6 years. 40%. So we have already a big problem. If we now said, well, you don't have to pay anything to go, that problem is going to grow. And there are zero negative consequences to doing poorly while in college. We already have a problem that the average college student spends less than 30 hours a week on their academic studies, going to class, studying for exams, reading, writing papers, all the things college students should be doing. At one time, they spent 40, 45 hours a week doing this back in the 1960s, say. Now they spend 26, 27 hours a week. So they're partly because of grade inflation, which brings up another topic we won't get into today. But so we have a lot of people who are going to college and are underworked as it is. If we let other people in to college and just say, come and spend several years with us. We don't care how you perform. If you get a below average grades, well, you can still keep going to college. There's we're not going to provide incentives for you to do well. Indeed, we are going to almost discourage that. You're going to make worse a problem that is already very serious. And we already have a large percentage of our young Americans who are most productive people. Who are the most productive people? The people in their 20s and the 30s. They're the ones who have the most physical strength. They're the ones who have the smartest minds. Uh, they're the ones that are the future, and we're underutilizing those resources.
So what's so interesting to me is I think back. So I graduated from Regis University in Denver, Colorado in 2011. And I got out in 3 years, by the way. I worked hard to make that
Good for
possible, to
you.
save a good chunk of change for a Jesuit private Catholic university, small liberal arts school, about 1,500 students. It was a great experience for me. Got my start in media, doing radio there and so forth. But I remember probably 2010, I was in an economics class, and economics was my minor at Regis University. And I remember we were given this task of writing an economist as a naturalist essay, where we didn't do our, research and find data, but instead we made an argument as to why we think a phenomenon is happening using economic principles. And I talked about student loan debt and the idea that the student loan system, as it's structured with the government giving out all these loans and grants and thereby encouraging the institutions of higher education to continue raising prices, I argued that point and that it was a significant thing we needed to address. And I don't remember exactly what the professor was saying, but she said I was wrong because of something called social demand. In other words, that there's a need for society to have highly educated people. Therefore, we should just keep throwing money at it, keep doing this kind of thing of the government providing support, which I don't recall her directly refuting the argument as to why prices were going higher and higher for students trying to go to school when it comes to tuition because of the student loan system. But that's a big point that they raise is, look, we just have to provide more government support because society needs it. It is beneficial to society. But as I pointed out in my monologue, Dr. Vedder, basic market principles like supply and demand do not go by the wayside simply because you deem a particular service beneficial.
Yeah. Now, I would add one added point here that I think is interesting. The people on the left, like the ones you mentioned earlier, Senator Sanders or Warren and so forth, often will point out, well, college graduates on average make a third more or 50% more, or often 100% more than high school graduates. And if we just have everyone go to college, we'll increase everyone's income more and it'll increase economic growth. But this ignores the fact that colleges are really a screening device. They screen out the people who are productive, who are disciplined, who are hardworking, who are like you, Jimmy, and graduated in college in 3 years because you worked hard at it. It screens out those kind of people from the people who are using college as a place, a gap 5 years or 6 years between high school and life. Those people that are just during the college years. Now, if you say, oh, college is free now, you don't have to pay anything for it. What are we going to get? We're going to get more of that. We're going to get more people who go to college and linger and stay around and say, hey, the federal government is taking care of me. I'm going to stay in college as long as I can. 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. And therefore, we're going to have a very costly system, very unproductive system, and we're going to bring up a lot of younger people who are not prepared for the lessons of life and for success in life.
Something else I want to bring in, going back to the conversation about the disparate racial impact of the current student loan system. There was a piece, and unfortunately I don't have imagery to put up on the screen, but there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal last week on that very topic. And in the piece entitled "The Disparate Racial Impact of Requiring a College Degree," which focuses on employers who are saying we must hire workers who have college degrees, they write, quote, "Research from Harvard Business School shows that degree inflation in job postings is pervasive. Example, 67% of postings for new production supervisors in 2015 included college degree requirements, though only 16% of existing production production supervisors had bachelor's degrees. Degree inflation is a barrier to entry for would-be employees of any race. Among workers over 25, only 40% of non-Hispanic whites and 26% of blacks have a bachelor's degree or higher. Given the racial gap in college attainment, however, degree inflation has a disparate impact on black Americans. The impact is amplified today by the effects of COVID-19 on public health, the job market, and access to college. Fundamentally, what is so contradictory to me is Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and others who have their views in terms of the current system and the kinds of reforms that they would like to see. The way in which they go about it, that would make the system even worse, as we're talking about, but at the same time, they say we need to support Black Lives Matter. But I would contend that genuine advocates of Black Lives Matter and the movement should be arguing for fundamental reforms on a basic level to get rid of this skyrocketing cost crisis that we are facing in higher ed that is a result of how the government has been through. Okay, fine, good intentions, well enough. We know the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but nevertheless, as a consequence, we have seen dramatically negative impacts.
Absolutely. The cost of college today is double, triple, whatever, what it was a generation ago. Exactly how much the increase is depends on how you measure it, but it's very, very substantial. And if, in fact, we were getting a lot of extra value out of that extra payment, I would say it's an investment in the future. So college costs more, but there's a lot of benefits from college. I don't think that's happening these days. By the way, I have been teaching since, Jimmy, no offense, but I started teaching when you were about minus 25 or minus 30. I've been around for a long time. When I started teaching, for every faculty member, let's say for every 2 faculty members, there was 1 administrator or some non-academic type at colleges doing things. Some of them were useful things. You needed people to run the computer center and to work in the library, and you needed people to mow the grass and so forth. We had that. 2 faculty, every administrator. This is true not only at my university, but this would be true nationally. Now, for every faculty member, there are more than 1 administrator. There are about 1.5 administrators. We have, in other words, the basic things colleges do are teaching and research. And the people who do the teaching and research are now a minority group, even within the colleges, because as all this extra tuition money came in, the colleges took it and they hired more and more administrators. And this has raised the cost a lot. There are a lot of other things going on. Some people will talk about intercollegiate athletic expenses and, a variety of other things. Research that on amok in some areas. We have professors of English writing obscure papers on obscure topics that no one reads and getting reduced teaching loads for it that they would be better off being in the classroom teaching students. I could list 100 of these problems of one sort or another, but we have ignored the students, and the federal government is largely responsible.
Yeah, make no mistake about it, that is true. One thing I'll add in is we see similar issues with K through 12 education. A few weeks ago, we were talking about K through 12 education reform, and one of the topics we hit on was administrative bloat. I mean, even as spending on K through 12 has gone up, teachers' pay has not. In some cases, teacher pay has even gone down as more administrators have been hired and taking up more and more of school budgets. And the same principle applies, as you're talking about, Professor Vedder, with regards to higher education. But we've just got a few minutes left, and I want to ask you this final question. We'll bring up this final topic at least. Maybe we'll have a couple more questions that come about as a result. But one thing that we are seeing right now is the pandemic. Coronavirus crisis across the country. It has made things very different in the year 2020 for colleges and universities across the country, most of which canceled classes, or at least canceled in-person classes midway through the second semester of the 2019-2020 school year. We're also seeing a lot of universities thinking about how they might do more online services and what have you come the fall. And there's now discussion about what this means for the bottom line of higher ed institutions as far as their financial situation, what that might mean for student debt increases because maybe the cost of college will rise, or maybe the cost of college will go down. I saw one report that some colleges and universities are offering steep discounts to those students who ask, one university even saying, "Yeah, we'll cut your tuition by 41%, which I think underscores how arbitrary the cost of college, the tuition levels often are, Professor Vedder. But what do you think are some of the potential impacts of this pandemic right now, what it could mean particularly for the cost of college?
Well, I think you're hitting on an important point. Those Jesuits at Regis did a halfway decent job with you, Jimmy. By the way, I have friends who have both taught and gone to school at Regis. It's a great school. Uh, it's supply and demand. What's happening right now to the demand for college? Well, it is down somewhat, partly for good reasons unrelated to COVID-19. A number of students going to college today is actually, even before the pandemic, was lower than in 2011. There had been some decline in enrollment already. But now it's aggravated by the risks associated with the pandemic. So the demand for higher ed is falling. The supply is big as ever. And so colleges are desperate for students. They're losing students. They're losing revenue. So what is happening? They're discounting. Let's make a deal. It's the art of the deal, as Trump would say. And if I were a parent of a student entering college this fall, I would say, well, you say the tuition is X. I can't afford X. I will come if you make it half of X or 60% of X. And a lot of parents are negotiating pretty good discounts from the tuition. And so I expect actual tuition fees collected per student will start falling because people are realizing college is no longer the great value proposition that it has been made out to be. And so this is going to lead to some reduction in spite of the student loan program. Some people are just saying no, and they've heard about the student loan program and the misery that can be created by running up a large debt and not being able to discharge the debt in bankruptcy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the one thing that could lead to some positive reform, I think.
Well, one thing I would like to see, Professor Vedder, is this idea of giving consumers more bargaining power when it comes to colleges and universities and going there by scaling back the student loan system. Like if ever there was a demonstration that we could do this by constricting a little bit the flow of liquidity that is basically just going directly to these institutions of higher education, it just might get them to start saying, maybe we need to cut tuition a little bit more, or might start empowering students if they're able to access fewer loans and grants to go to these universities and say, hey, I heard you gave my friend a discount of 41%. How about 45%? And I'll start going to your college.
That's right. And I think we're starting to see
Market
a little
forces.
more of that, which is, it's great. And we should do more. And we should can the whole program of student loans and go to income share agreements and other things. We probably don't have time to get into that, but there are other ways we could finance education for people who genuinely need money, and we could do it in a way that puts the burden not on the student, but on investors, private investors, and use market forces to determine the terms of these agreements, and it would work better for the student. It would make it a private enterprise thing, take the government out of it, all the politics out of it, all the administrative costs associated with the politics. We should change the whole system. And maybe this could lead to some moves in that direction. Let's hope so.
My mind is churning more and more as we're talking about the possibilities here. We shall see what happens in that regard. But I would add this one point, which is that when we look at the federal government's role expanding, especially when it nationalized the student loan system under Barack Obama, that really brought us to a point where, I mean, look, in 2004, 2005, it was about $350 billion in student loan debt across the country. Now it's $1.6 trillion. I'm not very good with math, but I know that that is a significant increase in just a span of 15 years. The ever-increasing role of the federal government in higher education costs, subsidies, and so forth has just made this situation worse and worse, hurting Americans of all swaths, but especially people who are in lower income groups and black and brown Americans across the country. And we need to address this, Professor Vedder.
I completely agree. 100%.
And I appreciate you joining us for a conversation to dive in. We will be looking at solutions later on this month, but I appreciate you helping us to get a better understanding of what's going on here, especially having done a tremendous amount of research as the original director for the Center for College Affordability and Productivity, and also, of course, as distinguished economics professor at Emeritus Professor of Economics at Ohio University. So thanks so much for joining us today, sir. Appreciate it.
I'm glad to be with you. Next time I'll wear a coat and tie for you, Jimmy, but it's sort of a half holiday today, so I decided not to. So,
no worries
thanks.
on the tie. You can see I'm not wearing a tie, but you're welcome to
Yeah,
wear a coat and a tie.
I noticed.
like that. In the era of COVID, we've had people wear T-shirts before. It really can go any way right now.
Yeah, great. Nice
All right,
being
Professor.
with you, Jimmy.
Professor Richard Vedder joining us here on the show. Thank you, sir, for taking the time today. All right. Great conversation. The point must be underscored. It is the federal government that has screwed things up. It is the federal government that has made life far more difficult financially for people across the country. If you believe that Black Lives Matter, for example, and you look at the data and what this student loan system has done in terms of hurting the black community, you cannot help but draw the conclusion that the federal government has set up a deeply flawed and destructive system that must be fundamentally reformed. Thanks for watching this clip of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel. You do not want to miss our live show. Thanks for your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.